I'm Marion Turner from Jesus College, University of Oxford. This is part of the series on Chaucer's contexts, and this lecture is about multilingualism, literacy and books. In Chaucer's England, many different languages were spoken. In 1417, 17 years after Chaucer's death, at an important council in Europe, the Council of Constance, England's representatives said that there were 5 languages spoken in England. These languages were English, Welsh, Gaelic, Gascon, a version of French, and Cornish. So people thought of the country as a multilingual space. And while some people might only know one language, many people would have some knowledge of a variety of different languages. In particular, any educated man would certainly be trilingual. So we're very used to living in quite monolingual country. Many people in our country today only speak and understand one language. But in Chaucer's time, he and all of the people that he knew, people who were well educated, knew Latin, French and English fluently. So those different languages were used for different things. So English would be most people's vernacular language, their mother tongue that they learnt first of all and that they used in day-to-day life. Although for some of the very rich, French might be their first language. For most people, Latin was the language of education and the language of the church. So if you went to school and university, you would be educated in Latin. That would be the language of instruction as well as the main thing that you were learning. So educated men knew Latin very well, and Latin was also the language of many different documents, of chronicles, and the language of the church. So when you went to church, as everyone did quite frequently, the services all took place in Latin. French was also a crucial language in England at the time. So French came into England at the time of the Norman Conquest. At that time, a lot of French words entered English, and that's when Old English transitions over time to Middle English, as English itself became Frenchified in various ways. But French itself as a language also remained very important, and the version of French that developed in England was known as Anglo-Norman, so it was a version of French specific to the British Isles. French remained the language of the aristocracy for quite some time, and in Chaucer's time there were still some aristocratic courts where French was mainly spoken. French also tended to be the language of the law courts and was often the language of many documents, of a great deal of documentary culture with which Chaucer worked and was very familiar. Many people also read texts in French, so literary texts were often produced in French rather than English. So while these different languages were all important, people were also very used to moving between different languages. So again, I think today we tend to think of languages often as quite separate or stratified. But in Chaucer's time, there are, for example, various poems which move between different languages. And there are some manuscripts where there are lots of different languages which are all important. So I'm going to show you an example from one medieval manuscript. This manuscript is in London's British Library and it's called Harley 978. Now in this manuscript there is a poem, a famous medieval poem called Summer is a-comin' in. So Summer is a-comin' in, loud sing cuckoo is an English poem. But in the manuscript, underneath that English line, there's a Latin line, and that is called Perspicae Christicula, see, O Christium. And if you can see on this manuscript, the 2 lines go underneath each other. So there is Summer is a-comin' in, and there is Perspicae Christicula. So the 2 lines work together, and the music notation shows that there might be different people singing those 2 different languages, the 2 different lines simultaneously. And in this case, the English line is a secular line. It's a line about fertility and nature, while the Latin line is a religious line. It has the same theme in a way about hope, a new life, but this time filtered through Christ and the church. So the two lines in some ways work against each other, but they also work together. And medieval readers and listeners would be very familiar with thinking about these different languages together. What we also often see in Chaucer's time is texts that might be written in one language but glossed in another. So a gloss is a comment, a commentary that people write at the side or next to a text on the manuscript page. So it's quite common, for instance, to have an English text that has then been glossed in Latin. And indeed, we see that quite a lot on Chaucer's texts. So for instance, there's lots of manuscripts of the Canterbury Tales where someone will have written biblical quotations in Latin next to, for instance, the Wife of Bath's English prologue, lots and lots of Latin commentary there. And in that case, it works really interestingly because you have the vernacular and then you have the Latin clerical voice coming in as a counter text to what the Wife of Bath is saying. And in that case, and the Wife of Bath is a very heavily glossed text in many manuscripts, you'll have the female vernacular voice and then the male clerical voice as a counter authority trying to speak against that voice and take authority from it in some ways. In Chaucer's time, of course, there is a great variety amongst different kinds of people in terms of who understood which languages and who had access to texts. So if we are talking about the average ploughman in the British Isles, that person was very likely not literate and did not have access to textual culture. But in Chaucer's world, people were highly literate. So Chaucer lived mainly in London and in the London area. Now in London, in Chaucer's day, literacy was approximately 50%. People are often quite surprised by that. If you think about this era, when of course there is limited schooling and there is no print, so there's no widely available books, but nonetheless people were highly literate. Many women were literate as well as men. Now some of these people would be literate in that they might be able to read but not write. Or they might have what we call functional or pragmatic literacy, where they could understand the kinds of notices or accounts that they needed to understand, but they couldn't read a complicated literary text, for instance. So literacy is variable, but there was quite wide literacy. And of course, also people could access texts often through the ear as well as through the eye. So we are used to silent reading, to reading for ourselves and often by ourselves. But medieval people were very much used to listening to text. So one person might have the text and be reading it out loud to a group of people who would hear it and then discuss it without necessarily reading it for themselves. And some people who were literate might choose to use other people to write their letters for them, for instance, because it was a mark of status not to do your own writing. So sometimes we see people who could write but who chose not to. There's lots of different kinds of texts circulating in Chaucer's time. So at this point, we get the development of more interest in public news kind of culture. So pamphlets, political pamphlets and religious pamphlets circulate in London in the late 14th century. Sometimes texts were pinned up on the walls and doors of churches, for instance, attacking people or making religious claims. So there's a sense of public texts that lots of people can access. In Chaucer's own life, he would be very familiar with French as an important language of high culture, that people would read French manuscripts at court, and most usually people would leave in their wills French texts if they were rich, not English ones. I'll talk a bit more in the next lecture about Chaucer's own reading. So finally, I'm just going to say a little bit about the kinds of books that are circulating widely at this time. Because it's before print, there isn't a mass circulation of books or a mass production of books. But that also means that rather than printers thinking about what will sell well, what do lots of people want, you get very much niche texts. So lots of manuscripts will have a really wide and strange varieties of texts in them because someone will have said, this is what I want. And then they'll have decided they want a rude poem, and then they also want a devotional treatise, but then also they've got a blank page and they write down a recipe in it, for example. So you get all kinds of different things in manuscripts. And the manuscript that I just showed you, which has Sing Cuckoo in, Summer is a Coming In, that also has in it texts in French, in Latin, in English. It has all kinds of different things in it. So you get a real mix of things in texts. You sometimes get very luxurious manuscripts that someone has commissioned, that they want to make themselves look important, to have a very beautiful book, a coffee table kind of book with lavish illustrations in it. But you also get very casual texts. And we don't have any manuscripts of Chaucer's own texts from his own lifetime. They all came later.